The pharmacy counter felt cold against my trembling fingers as I fumbled through my worn leather purse, searching for coins that weren't there. Behind me, a line of impatient customers shifted their weight, and I could feel their eyes boring into my back. The pharmacist, a young man with kind but tired eyes, cleared his throat gently. "Mrs. Chen, your total is $347 for this month's prescription." My heart sank. $347, the same amount my daughter Jessica spent on a single dinner at that fancy steakhouse downtown last week, judging by the Instagram photos she'd posted. I counted the crumpled 20s in my wallet again, knowing the math wouldn't change. $63. That's all I had left after paying rent and utilities in my cramped studio apartment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the fluorescent lights. "Could you hold on to these for me? I need to make some calls." The pharmacist nodded sympathetically, sliding the small white bag containing my heart medication and diabetes insulin back under the counter. As I turned to leave, an elderly man behind me in line shook his head and muttered something about the healthcare system to his wife. If only he knew the irony of his words. I walked out into the harsh afternoon sun, my chest tight, not just from the stress, but from the very condition these medications were meant to treat. My phone felt heavy in my hand as I scrolled to Jessica's number. We hadn't spoken in 3 weeks, not since our last argument about money. But what choice did I have? The phone rang 4 times before she answered, her voice clipped and professional. She was probably at her law firm, surrounded by colleagues who knew her as the rising star associate, not as the daughter who had forgotten where she came from. "Mom, I'm in a meeting. This better be important." "Jessica, honey, I need help with my medications again. The pharmacy says..." "Mom, we've talked about this. I can't keep bailing you out every month. You need to learn to budget better. Maybe, if you didn't waste money on those art supplies and pottery classes, you'd have enough for your pills." My free hand unconsciously touched the small clay vase sitting on my kitchen windowsill, one of the few pieces that had survived my move from the house Jessica grew up in. The house I'd sold to pay for her law school tuition, though she seemed to have forgotten that detail. "Please, Jessica, it's my heart medication. Without it..." "Mom, I have to go. Figure it out. Ask social services or something. That's what they're there for." The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long moment, watching people walk past me on the sidewalk, going about their lives while mine seemed to be unraveling thread by thread. A mother pushing a stroller smiled at me warmly, and I managed a weak smile back, remembering when Jessica was that age, when she would hold my hand and tell me I was the best mommy in the whole world. That night, I sat in my small apartment, looking out at the city lights through my single window. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional siren or car horn from the street below. I thought about calling Jessica again, maybe trying to explain how scared I was, how the doctor had warned me about missing doses. But her words echoed in my mind. Figure it out. What she didn't know, what nobody knew, was that I had figured it out long ago. 25 years ago, to be exact, when I was Dr. Margaret Chen, biochemist and entrepreneur, not just mom, struggling to make ends meet. What Jessica didn't know was that the very pharmaceutical company that manufactured my medications, Meridian Therapeutics, wasn't just some faceless corporation to me. I owned it. Margaret Chen hadn't always been the woman counting coins at a pharmacy counter. Once, she had been Dr. Margaret Reeves, a brilliant biochemist with calloused hands from years of lab work and eyes that sparkled with the kind of ambition that could move mountains. She had met David Chen during her postdoctoral research at Stanford, where she was developing revolutionary insulin delivery systems while he was finishing his MBA. Their love story began in the most unromantic of places, a campus coffee shop at 2 a.m, both of them exhausted from their respective studies. Margaret had been hunched over research papers, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing the same lab coat she'd had on for 36 hours straight. David had been practicing his pitch presentation for venture capital class, mumbling numbers and projections under his breath. When the coffee shop's ancient espresso machine broke down with a dramatic hiss and cloud of steam, they both looked up from their work at the same time and burst into laughter. It was the kind of spontaneous, genuine laughter that comes from shared exhaustion and the absurdity of life. David bought her a hot chocolate from the vending machine instead, and they talked until sunrise. "What drives you?" He had asked her that first morning, watching the way her face lit up when she talked about her research. "I want to create something that actually helps people," Margaret had replied, not knowing how prophetic those words would become. Not just papers and journals that 5 other scientists will read. Real medicine that changes real lives. They were married 2 years later in a small ceremony in Margaret's hometown of Portland, Oregon. Her parents, both immigrants from Taiwan who had worked double shifts at a textile factory to put her through school, cried tears of joy as they watched their daughter marry the man who believed in her dreams as much as they did. David's family, wealthy real estate developers from San Francisco, were politely supportive, though Margaret always sensed they thought their son was marrying beneath his station. After graduation, instead of taking the lucrative job offers from established pharmaceutical giants, Margaret and David decided to start their own company. They converted the garage of their tiny rented house in Palo Alto into a makeshift laboratory, spending their savings on basic equipment and raw materials. Margaret worked 18-hour days developing her insulin formulations, while David handled the business side, writing grant applications, courting investors, and managing their meager finances. Those early years were a beautiful struggle. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They lived on ramen noodles and shared dreams, often falling asleep at their respective workstations only to wake up and dive right back into their passion project. Margaret's breakthrough came 18 months after they started, when she successfully developed a time-release insulin delivery system that could reduce daily injections from multiple doses to just one. The implications were staggering, not just for patient quality of life, but for treatment compliance and long-term health outcomes. Jessica was born during their 3rd year in business, just as Meridian Therapeutics was beginning to gain recognition in the pharmaceutical community. Margaret had worked until the day she went into labor, and David had to practically carry her out of the lab when her contractions started. Even in the delivery room between pushes, she was discussing patent applications with their lawyer over the phone. "You're insane," David had laughed, holding her hand as another contraction hit. "Our daughter is going to think her mother is a workaholic." "Our daughter is going to think her mother changes the world," Margaret had replied, and she meant it. For the first few years of Jessica's life, their unconventional family setup worked beautifully. Margaret would conduct experiments while Jessica napped in a portable crib they'd set up in the corner of the lab. David handled business calls, while bouncing their daughter on his knee, teaching her to count using calculator buttons. Jessica's first words weren't mama or dada, but beaker, which sent Margaret into delighted tears. As Meridian Therapeutics grew, so did their family's comfort and stability. They moved from the garage lab to a proper facility, hired their first employees, and eventually moved into a beautiful house in Atherton with enough space for Margaret to have both a home office and a proper nursery for Jessica. Margaret's patents for insulin delivery systems and later, her groundbreaking work on heart medication absorption rates became the foundation for what would eventually become a pharmaceutical empire. But success in the biotech world required a delicate balance that Margaret was still learning to navigate. As the public face of Meridian Therapeutics, she found herself spending more time in boardrooms than laboratories, more time talking to investors than actually developing the medicines that had inspired her to start the company in the first place. David thrived in this environment, his natural charisma and business acumen making him the perfect partner for scaling their operation. Jessica grew up attending company picnics where she was the beloved princess of Meridian Therapeutics, charming employees and investors alike with her gap-toothed smile and precocious questions about science. Margaret would find her daughter in the lab after hours, carefully organizing test tubes by color, or pretending to take notes on important-looking clipboards. "Are you going to be a scientist like Mommy?" Margaret would ask, lifting Jessica onto her lap to look through the microscope. "I'm going to be even better than Mommy," Jessica would reply with the confidence only a 6-year-old could possess, making Margaret's heart swell with pride and possibility. The company's first major breakthrough came when Jessica was 8 years old. Margaret's team had successfully developed a revolutionary cardiac medication that could prevent heart attacks in high-risk patients with unprecedented effectiveness. The clinical trials were so successful that major pharmaceutical companies began circling like sharks, offering buyout deals that would have made Margaret and David multi-millionaires overnight. "We could sell," David had suggested one evening, as they sat in their kitchen, reviewing the latest offer from Pfizer. "Take the money, set Jessica up for life, maybe start something new." Margaret had been quiet for a long time, staring out at their backyard where Jessica was playing on the swing set David had built the previous summer. "Remember what I told you that first night in the coffee shop? About wanting to create something that actually helps people?" David nodded. "If we sell to them, our medications become just another line item in their profit margins. Prices go up, accessibility goes down, and the people who need these medicines most can't afford them." Margaret had turned to face her husband, her eyes bright with determination. "What if we stay independent? What if we build something different?" It was a pivotal moment that would define not just their company's future, but their family's legacy. They decided to remain independent, using their profits to fund more research and development while keeping their medication prices as low as possible without compromising quality. Margaret instituted a policy that Meridian Therapeutics would never price a medication beyond the reach of the patients who needed it most. "We're not just building a business," she had told their first major investor meeting. "We're building a bridge between scientific innovation and human dignity." The pharmaceutical industry thought she was naive. Wall Street analysts called her idealistic. But patients and doctors around the world began to take notice of the small company that was developing life-saving medications and selling them at prices that didn't force people to choose between their health and their mortgage payments. As Jessica entered her teenage years, she began to understand more about her parents' work and the impact they were having. She would accompany Margaret to medical conferences, watching her mother present research findings to rooms full of brilliant scientists. She saw the way doctors would approach Margaret afterward, sharing stories about patients whose lives had been transformed by Meridian medications. "Mom, do you ever get tired of all this?" Jessica had asked one evening when she was 15, finding Margaret still working in her home office at nearly midnight. "Tired of what, sweetheart?" "All the work, all the pressure, all the people, depending on you." Margaret had set down her pen and really looked at her daughter, this beautiful young woman who was growing up surrounded by the weight of responsibility and innovation. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but then I remember why. We started this. Every person who doesn't have to worry about affording their insulin, every heart attack that's prevented, every family that doesn't go bankrupt trying to stay healthy, that's what keeps me going." Jessica had nodded, but Margaret could see something shifting in her daughter's eyes, a kind of weariness that seemed too old for her 15 years. What Margaret didn't realize then was that Jessica was beginning to feel the pressure of being the daughter of someone who was quietly changing the world. At school, she was known as the medicine girl, expected to be brilliant in science classes she had no interest in. Her friends' parents would corner her at social events, asking if she could get them discounts on medications or if she knew about experimental treatments for their various ailments. "I just want to be normal," Jessica had confided to her best friend Sarah one afternoon. I want my mom to have a normal job that doesn't make everyone treat me like I'm some kind of charity case or connection to exploit. The irony was heartbreaking. Margaret had built her entire career around making life-saving medications accessible to everyone, and her own daughter felt burdened by that very mission. The distance between them began to grow slowly, imperceptibly at first, like a hairline crack in a foundation that wouldn't show its damage until years later. When Jessica announced she wanted to study law instead of following her parents into the sciences, Margaret was disappointed but supportive. Law is important too, she had said, hugging her daughter after the college acceptance letters arrived. The world needs people who understand how to protect patients' rights, how to navigate healthcare policy. I'm not going to be a healthcare lawyer, Mom, Jessica had replied quietly. I want to do corporate law. Real estate, mergers and acquisitions, things that have nothing to do with sick people and medicine and all of this. The words had stung, more than Margaret cared to admit, but she told herself it was just teenage rebellion, that Jessica would find her way back to understanding the importance of their family's work. She threw herself into supporting Jessica's law school dreams, just as she had once thrown herself into building Meridian Therapeutics. What Margaret couldn't have predicted was how dramatically their lives would change when David was diagnosed, with stage 4 pancreatic cancer during Jessica's second year of law school. The disease moved quickly, more aggressively than any of the medications Margaret had spent her career developing could combat. For the first time in her professional life, she found herself on the other side of the medical equation, not as a scientist developing treatments, but as a terrified wife watching her husband fade away, despite access to the best care money could buy. David's illness lasted 8 months, 8 months during which Margaret learned what it truly meant to be a patient's family member. She sat in hospital waiting rooms, navigated insurance complexities, and made impossible decisions about treatment options and quality of life. The irony wasn't lost on her that the woman who had dedicated her life to making healthcare accessible was now spending her days fighting bureaucracy and watching her savings account drain despite having excellent insurance. Jessica came home for the funeral, beautiful and composed in her black dress, holding Margaret's hand during the service while maintaining the kind of professional distance she had perfected during law school. She stayed for a week afterward, helping Margaret sort through David's belongings and handle the immediate logistics of widowhood. Mom, you should consider selling the company, Jessica had said one evening as they boxed up David's clothes for donation. You've proven your point. You've helped millions of people, and now you deserve to enjoy your life. Travel, relax, do all the things you and Dad never had time for. Margaret had been folding one of David's favorite sweaters, a soft, gray cashmere she had given him for their 10th anniversary. The company is our legacy, Jessica. It's what we built together. But Dad's gone now, Mom, and you're not getting any younger. What if something happens to you? What if you get sick? The suggestion felt like a betrayal, though Margaret knew Jessica meant well. Sell the company that had been their life's work. Abandon the mission that had driven them for over 2 decades. Walk away from the thousands of patients who depended on Meridian's affordable medications. It was unthinkable. I'm not ready to retire, Margaret had said firmly. And even if I were, I would never sell to one of the big pharma companies. They would jack up the prices the moment the ink dried on the contracts. Jessica had sighed. That particular sigh, Margaret remembered from her teenage years, the one that said, Mom doesn't understand the real world. After Jessica returned to law school, Margaret threw herself back into work with a vengeance that surprised even her closest colleagues. She worked longer hours than she had since the company's startup days, developing new medications and refining existing formulations. The house in Atherton felt too big and too quiet without David's laughter echoing through the halls, so she started spending most nights in her office, falling asleep on the couch and waking up to dive right back into research. The company continued to thrive under her leadership. But Margaret began to realize that she was becoming increasingly isolated from the world outside of Meridian Therapeutics. Her social circle consisted entirely of colleagues and business associates. She had lost touch with the few friends she'd maintained outside the pharmaceutical industry. Her relationship with Jessica consisted mainly of brief phone calls about practical matters and holiday visits that felt more obligatory than joyful. When Jessica graduated from law school and was hired by Preston Martinez and Associates, one of San Francisco's most prestigious corporate law firms, Margaret felt a complicated mix of pride and sadness. Pride because her daughter had achieved her goals through her own merit and hard work. Sadness because those goals seemed to be pulling Jessica further away from the values that had shaped Margaret's own life. "I'm making 6 figures right out of school, Mom," Jessica had announced during one of their monthly dinners. "I'm going to be able to afford a really nice apartment in the city, maybe even start saving for a house." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Margaret had replied, though she couldn't help but think about the research assistants at Meridian who made a fraction of Jessica's starting salary, despite working on projects that could save thousands of lives. The drift between them accelerated as Jessica became more established in her career. She joined the young professionals networking groups, started dating a fellow lawyer named Brad, who drove a Tesla and talked constantly about his investment portfolio, and moved into a luxury high-rise apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and a concierge service. Margaret watched her daughter's transformation from a distance, seeing glimpses of it through social media posts and the occasional photos Jessica would text her. Expensive dinners at trendy restaurants, weekend trips to Napa Valley, designer handbags that cost more than some of Margaret's employees made in a month. It wasn't that Margaret begrudged Jessica her success. She had worked hard for it. But she couldn't help feeling that somewhere along the way, her daughter had forgotten the lessons about empathy and responsibility that Margaret had tried to instill. The breaking point came during Jessica's 3rd year at the law firm, when Margaret was diagnosed with diabetes and a heart condition that required daily medication to manage. The irony was almost too painful to bear. The woman who had spent her career developing affordable medications for exactly these conditions was now facing her own health crisis. Margaret's doctor had prescribed a combination of medications that would cost nearly $400 per month even with her excellent insurance coverage. As the founder and CEO of a pharmaceutical company, she could easily afford the medications, but she was struck by the absurdity of the situation. Here, she was taking the very medications her company had developed to be affordable, and even with insurance, the cost was staggering. "The sad thing is," she had told her doctor during one of her follow-up appointments, "these medications cost less than $50 to manufacture. The markup is unconscionable." Her doctor, Dr. Patricia Williams, had nodded grimly. "I have patients who ration their insulin because they can't afford it. I have heart patients who skip doses to make their prescriptions last longer. It's a national crisis, and honestly, it's getting worse every year." Margaret had left that appointment with a renewed sense of purpose. She instructed her research team to investigate ways to make their medications even more affordable, perhaps by developing generic versions or finding more cost-effective manufacturing processes. But she also made a personal decision that would prove to be more significant than she could have imagined. She decided to experience the healthcare system not as Dr. Margaret Chen, pharmaceutical company CEO, but as simply Margaret Chen, patient. She created a separate identity for her medical care, using her maiden name and a modest address, paying out of pocket for her medications just like millions of other Americans who struggled with healthcare costs. It was an experiment in empathy that would ultimately cost her everything. Margaret's decision to experience healthcare as an ordinary patient began innocently enough. She opened a bank account under her maiden name, Margaret Reeves, and rented a small studio apartment in a modest neighborhood across town. To the outside world, she was simply a widow living on a fixed income, struggling to make ends meet like millions of other seniors across the country. The transformation required more than just paperwork. Margaret began dressing differently when She went to her medical appointments, trading her tailored suits for thrift store cardigans and worn jeans. She learned to navigate public transportation, something she hadn't done in decades, taking buses to doctor's offices in neighborhoods she had never visited despite living in the Bay Area her entire adult life. Dr. Williams had no idea that her new patient, the soft-spoken woman who counted pills carefully and asked about generic alternatives, was the same Dr. Margaret Chen whose innovations had revolutionized cardiac care. To her, Margaret Reeves was just another elderly patient worried about prescription costs, one of dozens she saw every week who faced impossible choices between medication and groceries. The first few months of living this double life were eye-opening in ways Margaret hadn't anticipated. She discovered that even with insurance, navigating the healthcare system as a regular patient was a labyrinthine nightmare of prior authorizations, formulary restrictions, and copay adjustments that seemed designed to discourage people from seeking care. She spent hours on hold with insurance companies, explaining her medical needs to representatives who seemed more interested in denying claims than helping patients. At Meridian Therapeutics, Margaret maintained her role as CEO, but she began viewing every decision through the lens of her patient experience. When her CFO proposed raising prices on their cardiac medications to match industry standards, Margaret flatly refused, even when the board pressured her to reconsider. "We're leaving money on the table," argued Robert Schneider, the head of their board of directors and a veteran of the pharmaceutical industry. "Our shareholders expect us to maximize profit margins. That's our fiduciary duty." "Our duty is to patients first, shareholders second," Margaret replied firmly. "The moment we prioritize profit over access, we become part of the problem we set out to solve." Robert's frustration was visible, but he had learned over the years that arguing with Margaret about pricing was futile. What he didn't know was that her conviction now came from personal experience, not just philosophical belief. Meanwhile, Jessica's life was moving in the opposite direction. She had been promoted to senior associate at her law firm, handling major acquisitions for technology companies and real estate developers. Her salary had jumped to nearly $200,000 a year, and she had moved into an even more expensive apartment in Pacific Heights with panoramic views of the Bay. Their monthly dinners had become increasingly strained. Jessica would talk about her cases, the deals she was closing, the bonuses she was earning, while Margaret listened and tried to connect this successful young woman to the little girl who used to ask thoughtful questions about helping sick people. The gap between their worlds seemed to widen with each conversation. "You know, Mom, you should really think about updating your investment portfolio," Jessica said during one of their dinners at an upscale Italian restaurant Jessica had chosen. "Brad's been helping me diversify into some really promising pharmaceutical stocks. The returns have been incredible." Margaret nearly choked on her wine. "Pharmaceutical stocks?" "Oh, yes. There's this company called Meridian something or other that's been undervaluing itself for years. Brad says they're sitting on patents worth billions, but they're too idealistic to monetize properly. He thinks they're ripe for acquisition by one of the major players." The irony was so sharp it was almost funny. Jessica was unknowingly discussing the financial dismantling of her mother's life's work, while Margaret sat across from her, powerless to explain the personal stakes involved without revealing her double life. "What makes you think this company is undervalued?" Margaret asked. Carefully. "Well, they develop all these amazing medications but price them way below market rate. It's almost like they're a charity instead of a business. Any competent management team would triple those prices overnight and still have customers because people need these medications to live." Margaret felt physically ill. This was her daughter, the child she had raised to understand the importance of accessibility and compassion, talking about exploiting sick people for profit as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "What about the patients who can't afford higher prices?" Margaret asked quietly. Jessica shrugged, cutting into her $40 piece of salmon. "That's what insurance is for. And if they can't afford insurance, there are government programs. It's not a pharmaceutical company's responsibility to subsidize healthcare for the entire country. The conversation haunted Margaret for weeks. She began to realize that somewhere along the way, she had failed to pass on the values that had driven her to build Meridian in the first place. Jessica saw healthcare as just another commodity, patients as just another market to be optimized for profit. As Margaret's health condition worsened, requiring more frequent doctor visits and additional medications, she found herself struggling to maintain her dual existence. The stress of running a major pharmaceutical company while pretending to be a struggling patient was taking its toll. She lost weight, developed chronic insomnia, and began having anxiety attacks that her cardiologist attributed to her heart condition. Dr. Williams prescribed additional medications for anxiety and sleep, bringing Margaret's monthly prescription costs to nearly $500. Even with her patient assistance programs and generic alternatives, the financial burden would have been crushing for someone actually living on a fixed income. "I have patients who are choosing between food and medication," Dr. Williams confided during one of Margaret's appointments. "I've started keeping samples in my office, but the pharmaceutical companies are cutting back on those programs too. It's heartbreaking to write a prescription knowing the patient probably can't afford to fill it." Margaret wanted to tell her that help was available, that Meridian had patient assistance programs that could cover these costs, but she couldn't without breaking character. Instead, she asked, "What would happen if someone just couldn't afford their heart medication?" Dr. Williams's expression grew grave. "With your particular condition, missing doses could trigger arrhythmia, possible heart attack, even sudden cardiac death. These medications aren't optional, Mrs. Reeves. They're literally keeping you alive." That night, Margaret lay in her small studio apartment, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the millions of people who faced this exact dilemma every day. People who worked full-time jobs but couldn't afford their medications. Seniors who had worked their entire lives but found their retirement savings depleted by medical costs. Parents who skipped their own medications to pay for their children's needs. She thought about Jessica, probably out at another expensive dinner with Brad, completely oblivious to the healthcare crisis that was destroying families across the country. Her daughter lived in a bubble of privilege that Margaret had inadvertently created by providing her with every opportunity and advantage money could buy. The crisis in their relationship came to a head during Thanksgiving dinner at Jessica's apartment. Margaret had brought a homemade pie, one of the few cooking skills she still maintained from her graduate school days, and was looking forward to spending quality time with her daughter. Jessica's apartment was decorated like something from a magazine, all clean lines and expensive furniture that looked beautiful but felt cold. Brad was there, pontificating about market trends while Jessica hung on his every word like he was delivering prophecies from Mount Olympus. "The pharmaceutical industry is really where the smart money is right now," Brad announced over dinner, gesturing with his wine glass. "People are always going to get sick, which means there's always going to be demand. It's recession-proof." "That's a rather cynical way to look at healthcare," Margaret said mildly. Brad laughed. "Cynical? It's realistic. These companies spend billions developing new medications. They deserve to recoup their investments and make a profit. It's basic economics." "But what about people who can't afford those profits?" Margaret pressed. "Look, Mrs. Chen, I understand the bleeding heart perspective, but business is business. If a company doesn't maximize shareholder value, they'll get replaced by competitors who will. It's not personal. It's just how the system works." Jessica nodded along enthusiastically. "Mom, you've always been too idealistic about this stuff. The world doesn't run on good intentions." Margaret felt something break inside her chest, and she wasn't sure if it was her heart condition or her spirit. This was her daughter, the child she had hoped would carry on their family's legacy of compassion and service, dismissing the very values that had shaped Margaret's entire life. "Idealistic," Margaret repeated slowly. "Is that what you call caring about whether people can afford to stay alive?" "Mom, don't be so dramatic. Jessica said, rolling her eyes. People figure it out. They always do. Do they? Margaret's voice was sharper now. Do they figure it out when they're rationing insulin and end up in diabetic coma? Do they figure it out when they can't afford their heart medication and die of a heart attack at 55? Brad and Jessica exchanged a look that Margaret recognized immediately. It was the same look she had seen from David's family all those years ago, the look that said, she's being emotional and unreasonable again. Mom, maybe you should talk to someone about this, Jessica said in the patronizing tone she might use with a difficult client. You seem really stressed about healthcare stuff lately. Are you feeling okay? Are you keeping up with your own medications? The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. Here was her daughter, concerned about Margaret's mental state for caring too much about sick people, while simultaneously being completely indifferent to Margaret's own health struggles. Margaret excused herself to use the bathroom, where she sat on the edge of the bathtub and tried to process what had just happened. Her daughter, who made more money in a month than most people made in a year, had just questioned Margaret's mental stability for expressing concern about healthcare accessibility. When she returned to the dining room, the conversation had moved on to Jessica's upcoming vacation plans. She and Brad were planning a 2-week trip to Europe, staying at luxury hotels and dining at Michelin-starred restaurants. The cost of their vacation would have covered a year's worth of medications for dozens of patients, but Margaret knew better than to point out that particular irony. She left early that evening, claiming fatigue, and drove back to her apartment in a daze. For the first time since David's death, Margaret felt truly alone. Her daughter had become someone she barely recognized, someone whose values were so fundamentally different from her own that meaningful communication seemed impossible. Over the following months, their relationship deteriorated further. Jessica's calls became less frequent and more perfunctory, usually brief check-ins that felt more like obligations than genuine concern. When Margaret mentioned struggling with prescription costs, Jessica's responses became increasingly dismissive. Mom, you need to be more proactive about managing your finances, Jessica would say. Maybe cut back on unnecessary expenses. You really need cable TV? Are you eating out too much? Margaret wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Her daughter, who spent more on a single dinner than Margaret's entire weekly grocery budget, was lecturing her about financial responsibility. But she couldn't explain the irony without revealing her double life, so she simply endured the condescension. The situation reached its nadir when Margaret's pharmacy informed her that her insurance had changed their formulary, and her heart medication was no longer covered. The new copay would be $600 per month, an amount that would have been genuinely devastating for someone living on a fixed income. Margaret called Jessica from the pharmacy parking lot, her hands shaking as she dialed the number. Jessica, I need help. The insurance company changed their policy, and now my heart medication costs $600 a month. I don't have that kind of money. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mom, we've talked about this. I can't keep bailing you out every time you have a financial problem. You need to take responsibility for your own situation. This isn't a financial problem, Jessica. This is a life or death situation. Without this medication, then figure out another solution. Call your doctor, ask about generics, apply for patient assistance programs. There are resources available if you're willing to do the work to find them. I've tried all of that. The generic isn't as effective for my condition, and the patient assistance programs have waiting lists that are months long. Jessica's voice took on the cold, professional tone Margaret recognized from her legal career. Mom, I'm not going to enable your learned helplessness. You're a smart woman. You'll figure it out. The line went dead, and Margaret sat in her car, staring at the phone in disbelief. Learned helplessness. Her daughter had just accused her of learned helplessness for asking for help with life-saving medication. That night, Margaret sat in her studio apartment, looking at the bottle of heart medication she couldn't afford to refill. Dr. Williams had been clear about the consequences of missing doses, but Jessica had been equally clear about her unwillingness to help. For the first time since beginning her experiment in patient advocacy, Margaret wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. She had wanted to understand the struggles of ordinary patients, to experience firsthand the barriers that prevented people from accessing affordable health care. She had succeeded beyond her wildest expectations, but in the process, she had discovered that her own daughter had become exactly the kind of person Margaret had spent her career fighting against. The irony was crushing. Margaret owned the pharmaceutical company that manufactured her medications. She had enough money in her personal accounts to buy the pharmacy where she couldn't afford to fill her prescriptions. She employed hundreds of people whose job it was to ensure patients could access affordable medications. But her own daughter, the person who should have cared most about Margaret's well-being, had dismissed her struggles as a character flaw. Margaret realized that her experiment had revealed something far more painful than the failures of the healthcare system. It had revealed the failure of her own parenting, the complete breakdown of the values she had tried to instill in her daughter, and the devastating isolation that came from discovering that the person you loved most in the world had fundamentally different ideas about human worth and dignity. As she sat in the darkness of her small apartment, Margaret began to formulate a plan. It wasn't a plan for revenge or vindication, but a plan for truth. Jessica needed to understand the real consequences of her indifference, not just to abstract patients she would never meet, but to the people closest to her. Margaret had spent months learning what it felt like to be powerless in the face of an uncaring system. Now it was time for Jessica to learn what it felt like to discover that her assumptions about that system and about her own mother were completely wrong. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight, and it wouldn't be dramatic. Like the best pharmaceutical interventions, it would be precisely calibrated, carefully timed, and ultimately life-changing for everyone involved. Margaret reached for her laptop and began typing. She had work to do. The weeks following Jessica's rejection felt like drowning in slow motion. Margaret found herself rationing her heart medication, cutting pills in half and skipping doses when she felt relatively stable. Dr. Williams had warned her about this exact scenario, but Margaret needed to understand what millions of patients faced every day when forced to choose between financial survival and physical health. The physical effects came quickly. Her energy levels plummeted, leaving her exhausted after climbing a single flight of stairs. Her heart rhythm became irregular, creating a fluttering sensation in her chest that made her feel like a bird trapped in a cage. Sleep became elusive as anxiety about her condition kept her awake, staring at the ceiling of her studio apartment and listening to her own heartbeat skip and stumble. At Meridian Therapeutics, Margaret's colleagues began to notice changes in her appearance and demeanor. Her normally sharp focus seemed scattered during board meetings. She would pause mid-sentence, pressing her hand to her chest as if checking that her heart was still beating. Her assistant, Linda, had worked with her for 15 years and knew something was seriously wrong. "Dr. Chen, are you feeling all right?" Linda asked one afternoon after Margaret had to sit down abruptly during a walk through the research labs. "You look pale, and you seem short of breath." Margaret wanted to confide in someone, to share the bizarre double life she had been living and the devastating discovery about her daughter's values. But how could she explain that the CEO of a pharmaceutical company couldn't afford her own medications without revealing the elaborate deception she had constructed? "Just tired," Margaret replied, forcing a smile. "I've been working too many late nights." Linda looked unconvinced but didn't press further. She had learned over the years that Dr. Chen was intensely private about personal matters, a trait that had served her well in the competitive pharmaceutical industry, but sometimes isolated her from the people who cared about her most. The isolation was becoming unbearable. Margaret's social circle had always been small, consisting mainly of colleagues and industry contacts who knew her as the brilliant, successful CEO, not as a woman struggling with family betrayal and health crises. She couldn't share her patient experience with them without compromising her professional reputation. and she couldn't discuss her CEO responsibilities with Dr. Williams without breaking the carefully constructed identity of Margaret Reeves. During one particularly difficult night, when her heart palpitations were severe enough to make her consider calling an ambulance, Margaret sat on the floor of her studio apartment bathroom and tried to process the surreal nature of her situation. She owned a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars, employed over 2,000 people, and had patents on medications that had saved countless lives. Yet here she was, alone and afraid, unable to afford the very medicines her company had developed. The thought that struck her most forcefully wasn't about the injustice of the healthcare system, or even about Jessica's cruelty. It was about the profound loneliness of her predicament. She had no one to call. No one who would understand the full scope of what she was experiencing. No one who would believe the complete truth of her situation. Margaret's phone rang, startling her out of her dark thoughts. The caller ID showed Dr. Williams's office number, which was unusual for an evening call. "Mrs. Reeves? This is Dr. Williams. I'm calling because your pharmacy contacted my office about your prescription. Apparently, you haven't picked up your refill, and it's been over a week since it was ready." Margaret closed her eyes, knowing this conversation was inevitable. "I'm having some financial difficulties, doctor. I'm trying to figure out a solution. Mrs. Reeves, we've discussed this before. Your heart condition is serious. Missing doses of your medication could trigger a cardiac event. I need you to understand that this isn't optional." "I understand the medical necessity," Margaret said quietly. "But understanding doesn't change the fact that I don't have $600 for pills." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Listen, I'm going to do something I don't usually do. I have some sample packs in my office from Pharmaceutical representatives. It's only enough for about 2 weeks, but it might buy you some time to figure out a long-term solution." Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. Here was a doctor she barely knew, offering her charity samples to keep her alive, while her own daughter had dismissed her struggles as a character flaw. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything. Just promise me you'll pick them up tomorrow morning. And Mrs. Reeves, please keep trying to find assistance programs or other options. I've seen too many patients end up in the emergency room because they couldn't afford their medications." After hanging up, Margaret sat in the darkness of her apartment and felt something shift inside her. Dr. Williams's kindness had reminded her that there were still people in the world who understood that healthcare was about human dignity, not just profit margins. But it had also crystallized her determination to follow through on the plan she had been developing. The next morning, Margaret drove to Dr. Williams's office to pick up the sample medications. The waiting room was crowded with elderly patients, many of whom looked worried and tired. She overheard conversations about insurance denials, medication, costs, and difficult choices between treatments and other necessities. These were her people, Margaret realized. Not the pharmaceutical executives in their expensive suits, but the patients struggling to navigate a system that seemed designed to exhaust them into submission. Dr. Williams handed her a small bag containing 2 weeks' worth of medication samples. "I wish I could do more," she said quietly. "The pharmaceutical companies used to provide more samples, but they've been cutting back on those programs. They claim it's about compliance and tracking, but I think it's really about forcing patients to pay full price." Margaret wanted to tell her that Meridian Therapeutics still maintained robust sample programs for physicians, that they had specifically designed their patient assistance programs to be accessible rather than bureaucratic obstacles, but she simply nodded and thanked the doctor for her kindness. That afternoon, Margaret returned to her role as CEO of Meridian Therapeutics with renewed focus. She called an emergency meeting with her executive team to discuss expanding their patient assistance programs and developing new initiatives to help uninsured and underinsured patients access medications. "I want us to partner directly with physician offices," she announced to the surprised executives. "Not just providing samples, but creating on-site assistance programs where patients can apply for help right in their doctor's office and get approved immediately. Robert Schneider, the board chairman, looked skeptical. That's going to be expensive to implement and manage. What's the business case for expanding charity programs when we're already pricing below market rates? The business case is that we're a pharmaceutical company, not a pharmaceutical charity, interjected Michael Torres, the chief financial officer. Our shareholders expect us to maximize returns, not subsidize the healthcare system. Margaret felt her heart rate spike, and she pressed her hand to her chest instinctively. These were smart, educated people who understood the pharmaceutical industry inside and out, yet they seemed completely disconnected from the human impact of their decisions. Our shareholders invested in Meridian because we've built a sustainable business model based on accessibility, Margaret replied firmly. We've proven that you can be profitable while keeping medications affordable. What I'm proposing will strengthen that model, not undermine it. But at what cost? Robert pressed. Every dollar we spend on charity programs is a dollar that doesn't go to research and development or shareholder returns. We have fiduciary duties to consider. Margaret wanted to scream that fiduciary duty should include responsibility to patients, not just investors. She wanted to tell them about the elderly woman she had seen in Dr. Williams's waiting room, counting pills to make them last longer. She wanted to explain that the choice between medication and rent wasn't a theoretical business problem, but a daily reality for millions of Americans. Instead, she took a deep breath and said, I'm not asking for a vote. I'm informing you of a decision I've made as CEO. We're expanding our patient assistance programs, and we're going to find innovative ways to make our medications accessible to everyone who needs them. The meeting ended with uncomfortable silence and exchanged glances among the executive team. Margaret knew she was pushing against institutional resistance, but she also knew that her unique perspective as both CEO and patient gave her insights that her colleagues couldn't understand. Over the following weeks, Margaret threw herself into developing new patient assistance initiatives while simultaneously living the reality of being one of the patients these programs were designed to help. She worked with her team to streamline application processes, eliminate bureaucratic barriers, and create partnerships with community health centers and physician offices. The irony of her situation became even more pronounced when she received a call from Linda about Meridian's patient assistance program. Dr. Chen, I've been reviewing our assistance program applications, and I noticed we've had a significant increase in requests lately. The good news is that we're approving almost everyone who applies, but I wanted to make sure you're aware of the volume. Margaret felt a strange mixture of pride and sadness. Pride that her company was successfully helping patients who couldn't afford their medications, and sadness that the need was so overwhelming. How many applications are we processing monthly? We're up to about 3,000 applications per month, and that's just for our cardiac medications. The diabetes medications are seeing similar numbers. 3,000 people every month who couldn't afford the medications they needed to survive. 3,000 families making impossible choices between health and financial stability. Margaret thought about her own experience with Jessica's dismissal and multiplied that pain by thousands. Linda, I want you to do something for me. Create a report showing the demographics of our assistance program recipients: age, geographic location, employment status, insurance coverage. I want to understand exactly who we're helping. The report arrived on Margaret's desk 3 days later, and the data was both heartbreaking and illuminating. The average age of recipients was 62, the same as Margaret's own age. Most were employed, but in jobs that didn't provide adequate health insurance. Many were retirees whose pension benefits had been reduced or eliminated. A significant percentage were people who had been diagnosed with chronic conditions that required long-term medication management. Margaret realized she was looking at a statistical representation of her own circumstances. If she had actually been Margaret Reeves, struggling retiree, rather than Dr. Margaret Chen, pharmaceutical CEO, she would have been one of these statistics. That evening, Margaret sat in her studio apartment with the report spread across her small dining table, cross-referencing the data with her own experience as a patient. She understood now why so many people fell through the cracks of the healthcare system. Even with insurance, even with assistance programs, even with caring physicians like Dr. Williams, the system was designed in ways that made accessing care a constant battle. Her phone rang, interrupting her analysis. The caller ID showed Jessica's number, and for a moment, Margaret felt a surge of hope. Maybe her daughter had reconsidered. Maybe she had realized the cruelty of her previous response. "Hi, Jessica," Margaret answered, trying to keep the hope out of her voice. "Mom, I'm calling because I just heard something interesting from Brad. He said his firm is working on a potential acquisition deal involving a pharmaceutical company called Meridian Therapeutics. Do you know anything about that?" Margaret's blood ran cold. What kind of acquisition? Apparently, some major pharmaceutical companies are circling around Meridian because they think the current management is leaving money on the table. Brad says they're practically giving away medications that could be priced much higher. He thinks it's a perfect acquisition target for a company that knows how to maximize profitability. The room seemed to spin around Margaret. Her own daughter was gleefully discussing the potential dismantling of everything Margaret had spent her career building, completely unaware that she was talking about her mother's life's work. "What would happen to the patients who depend on those affordable medications?" Margaret asked quietly. Jessica laughed, the same dismissive laugh Margaret had heard so many times recently. "Mom, you're doing it again. The patients will figure it out. Maybe they'll get better insurance or find different medications or qualify for assistance programs. The market always finds a way to work these things out." Margaret felt something crystallize inside her chest, a cold clarity that cut through months of confusion and hurt. Her daughter wasn't just indifferent to patient suffering. She was actively participating in systems designed to increase that suffering for financial gain. "Jessica," Margaret said slowly, "what if I told you that I was one of those patients? What if I told you that I depend on Meridian medications, and that their affordable pricing is the only thing standing between me and financial ruin?" There was a pause. Then Jessica's voice took on that familiar patronizing tone. "Mom, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You're being overly dramatic and making everything personal. This is just business. Companies get bought and sold all the time. It's how the economy works. So, if the price of my medications tripled overnight because of one of these acquisitions, that would just be how the economy works?" "Yes, Mom. That's how markets function. If you can't afford the market price for something, you find alternatives or you do without. That's not cruel. It's just reality." Margaret hung up the phone without saying goodbye. She sat in the silence of her apartment, feeling something fundamental shift inside her. The daughter she had raised, the child she had hoped would carry on their family's legacy of compassion and service, had just told her that if Margaret couldn't afford to stay alive, she should simply do without. For the first time since beginning her patient experiment, Margaret felt genuinely afraid. Not just of her heart condition or the financial stress, but of the possibility that she had completely failed as a mother. How had she raised someone who could look at human suffering and see only market efficiency? Margaret reached for her laptop and began typing. It was time to end her double life, but not in the way she had originally planned. Jessica needed to understand the real consequences of her worldview, and Margaret was going to make sure that understanding was as shocking and educational as possible. The plan that emerged from Margaret's laptop over the next several hours was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Jessica wanted to see healthcare as a business transaction, with patients as customers who should accept whatever prices the market demanded. Margaret was going to show her exactly what that philosophy looked like when applied to someone Jessica was supposed to love. But first, Margaret had to make sure that when the revelation came, it would be impossible for Jessica to dismiss or rationalize away. The truth needed to be so clear so undeniable, and so personally relevant that even Jessica's carefully constructed professional detachment wouldn't be able to protect her from its impact. Margaret began making phone calls, scheduling meetings, and setting in motion a series of events that would bring her two lives together in the most dramatic way possible. Jessica wanted to treat healthcare like a business? Fine. Margaret was going to give her the business education of a lifetime. Margaret's first call was to Dr. Williams, but not as Margaret Reeves, the struggling patient. This time, she called as Dr. Margaret Chen, CEO of Meridian Therapeutics. Dr. Williams, this is Margaret Chen from Meridian Therapeutics. I understand you've been treating one of our patient assistance program candidates, and I'd like to discuss her case personally. Dr. Williams sounded surprised but pleased. Dr. Chen, what an honor. I've been following your work for years. Your company's approach to affordable medications has been revolutionary. Which patient are you calling about? Margaret Reeves. I believe she's been struggling to afford her cardiac medications, and you've been providing her with sample packs. Oh yes, Mrs. Reeves. She's such a sweet woman, but her situation is heartbreaking. She's exactly the kind of patient your assistance programs are designed to help, but she seems hesitant to apply. I think there's some pride involved, you know. Some people find it difficult to ask for help, even when they desperately need it. Margaret smiled grimly. If only Dr. Williams knew the real reason for that hesitation. I'd like to expedite her application process. In fact, I'd like to invite her to our facility for a comprehensive consultation about her treatment options and our assistance programs. Would you be willing to refer her directly to me? That's incredibly generous of you, Dr. Chen. I'll call her this afternoon and let her know about this opportunity. She'll be so relieved. Margaret's second call was to her head of security at Meridian Therapeutics. James, I need you to arrange something unusual for me. I'm expecting a visitor next week who will be coming under the name Margaret Reeves. I want you to personally escort her to my office, but I don't want anyone else to know her real identity or the purpose of her visit. James Rodriguez had worked security for Meridian for 8 years and had learned not to question Dr. Chen's occasional unusual requests. Of course, Dr. Chen. Any special security protocols I should be aware of? Just discretion. This is a very sensitive matter involving patient privacy. Margaret's third call was to Linda, her assistant. Linda, I need you to clear my schedule for next Thursday afternoon. I'm going to be conducting a very important consultation with a potential patient assistance candidate, and I don't want any interruptions. Should I prepare any specific materials for the meeting? Yes, actually. I want you to pull together a comprehensive presentation about our company's history, our mission statement, our patient assistance programs, and our pricing philosophy. Make it detailed but accessible to someone without a pharmaceutical background. That's quite a bit of material. How long should I plan for this consultation? Margaret considered the question carefully. How long would it take to reveal 25 years of deception and completely shatter her daughter's worldview? Plan for at least 2 hours, possibly longer. The most difficult call was to Jessica. Margaret had to invite her daughter to Meridian Therapeutics without revealing the true purpose of the visit. She decided to use Jessica's own professional interests as the hook. Jessica, I have an interesting opportunity for you. I've been following some of the pharmaceutical industry analysis your firm has been doing, and I think you might benefit from touring one of the local companies to better understand the business model. Jessica sounded intrigued. Which company? Meridian Therapeutics. They're the one Brad mentioned. The company that supposedly leaves money on the table with their pricing strategy. I thought you might want to see their operation firsthand before your firm gets too involved in any acquisition discussions. That's actually a brilliant idea, Mom. Brad would be so impressed if I could provide insider intelligence about their operations. How did you arrange this? Margaret almost laughed at the irony. I have some connections in the industry. They're willing to give you a comprehensive tour and consultation next Thursday afternoon. Would that work for your schedule? Absolutely. This could be huge for my career. Thank you, Mom. I really appreciate you thinking of me. The gratitude in Jessica's voice was painful to hear, knowing what was coming. But Margaret reminded herself that sometimes love required delivering hard truths, even when those truths would cause pain. Over the next week, Margaret prepared for the revelation with the same meticulous attention to detail she had once applied to pharmaceutical research. She reviewed every document related to her patient assistance applications as Margaret Reeves, cross-referenced her medical records with Dr. Williams's notes, and prepared a timeline of her health struggles alongside Jessica's dismissive responses. She also prepared emotionally for what would likely be the most difficult conversation of her life. In her studio apartment, Margaret practiced different ways of revealing the truth, trying to find an approach that would maximize understanding, while minimizing the potential for Jessica to retreat into defensive anger. The revelation needed to be undeniable, immediate, and personal. Jessica had spent months dismissing Margaret's patient struggles as character flaws or poor planning. She needed to understand that those struggles belonged to someone she was supposed to love unconditionally. Margaret also spent time reflecting on her own role in creating the situation. Had she failed as a mother by not instilling stronger values in Jessica? Had she been too focused on providing financial advantages without teaching the responsibility that should accompany privilege? Had her own success insulated Jessica from understanding the realities faced by ordinary people? These questions didn't have easy answers, but Margaret knew that avoiding them wouldn't help either of them move forward. The revelation would be painful for both of them, but it might also be the only way to salvage any meaningful relationship between them. On Wednesday evening, Margaret made one final preparation. She drove to her studio apartment as Margaret Reeves and gathered all the evidence of her patient experience. Prescription bottles with her assumed name, medical bills addressed to Margaret Reeves, patient assistance program applications she had filled out but never submitted, and a journal she had kept documenting her experiences navigating the healthcare system as an ordinary patient. She also brought the report Linda had prepared about Meridian's patient assistance program demographics. Jessica needed to understand that Margaret Reeves wasn't an isolated case, but one of thousands of people struggling with identical challenges. Thursday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Margaret's mood as she prepared for what would either be a breakthrough or a complete breakdown in her relationship with her daughter. She dressed carefully in her CEO attire, the tailored suits and professional accessories that marked her as Dr. Margaret Chen, pharmaceutical executive, rather than Margaret Reeves, struggling patient. At Meridian Therapeutics, Margaret arrived early and spent time walking through the research labs where her career had begun. She touched the equipment, breathed in the familiar sense of chemicals and possibility, and reminded herself why she had built this company in the first place. Not for profit or recognition, but to help people like the woman she had been pretending to be for the past several months. Linda knocked on her office door at noon. "Dr. Chen, your consultation appointment has arrived. Should I bring her up?" "Actually, I'll come down to meet her personally. And Linda, after I bring her upstairs, please hold all calls and interruptions until I let you know we're finished." Margaret took the elevator down to the lobby, her heart pounding with anxiety and anticipation. Through the glass doors, she could see Jessica waiting in the reception area, dressed in her best professional attire and checking her phone. Next to her sat an elderly woman with gray hair and a worn cardigan who appeared to be waiting for her own appointment. For a moment, Margaret almost lost her nerve. Jessica looked so confident, so successful, so completely unprepared for what was about to happen. But then Margaret remembered the coldness in her daughter's voice when she had dismissed patient suffering as market efficiency, and her resolve hardened. Margaret walked through the lobby doors and approached the reception desk. "I'm here to collect Margaret Reeves for her consultation appointment." The receptionist looked confused, scanning her appointment list. "I'm sorry, Dr. Chen, but I don't see a Margaret Reeves on today's schedule." Margaret smiled calmly. "That's quite all right. Margaret Reeves is right here." She turned to face Jessica, who was looking up from her phone with a puzzled expression. "Mom? What are you doing here?" I thought I was meeting with a Meridian executive about a tour. You are meeting with a Meridian executive, Jessica. And you're also meeting with Margaret Reeves, the patient you've been so concerned about. Margaret's voice was steady, but her hands were trembling slightly. They're the same person. Jessica blinked several times, as if trying to process information that didn't fit into any of her existing categories. I don't understand what you're saying. Let me be clearer then. I am Dr. Margaret Chen, founder and CEO of Meridian Therapeutics. I am also Margaret Reeves, the elderly patient who has been struggling to afford her medications for the past 6 months. The woman you told to figure it out when she asked for help with her heart medication is standing right in front of you. The color drained from Jessica's face as the implications of Margaret's words began to sink in. That's impossible. You're confusing me with someone else. You don't take medications. You're not struggling financially. You're successful and healthy and… Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out 2 sets of identification. Dr. Margaret Chen's driver's license and corporate ID card, and Margaret Reeves's medical insurance card and patient assistance program application. She handed them to Jessica, who stared at them as if they were written in a foreign language. The woman who called you begging for help with her heart medication was me. The woman whose struggles you dismissed as learned helplessness was me. The woman you told should do without if she couldn't afford market prices for life-saving medication was me. Jessica looked around the lobby as if searching for an escape route or an explanation that would make this revelation make sense. But why would you pretend to be someone else? Why would you lie to me about your financial situation? Because I wanted to understand what our patients experience when they can't afford their medications. Because I wanted to see the healthcare system from the perspective of someone who doesn't have power or privilege or connections. And because I wanted to know how my own daughter would respond to someone she thought was powerless and in need. Margaret gestured toward the elevator. Shall we continue this conversation in my office? I think we have quite a lot to discuss. The elevator ride to the executive floor was silent, except for the mechanical humming of the machinery. Jessica stared at the floor indicator numbers as they climbed, her professional composure completely shattered. Margaret watched her daughter's reflection in the polished steel doors and saw not the confident lawyer who had dismissed patient suffering, but a confused young woman trying to reconcile contradictory information about someone she thought she knew. Margaret's office occupied a corner of the building with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering panoramic views of the Bay Area. The walls were lined with framed patents, industry awards, and photographs from medical conferences and charitable events. On her desk sat a small framed photo of Jessica's college graduation, alongside research papers and pharmaceutical industry reports. "Please, sit down," Margaret said, gesturing to the comfortable chairs arranged around a small conference table. She poured 2 glasses of water from a pitcher Linda had prepared, noting that Jessica's hands were shaking slightly as she accepted the glass. "I still don't understand," Jessica said quietly. "If you own this company, if you're successful and wealthy, why would you pretend to struggle with medication costs? What was the point of lying to me?" Margaret opened the folder she had prepared and spread the contents across the table. Patient assistance program applications, medical bills addressed to Margaret Reeves, prescription bottles, and the demographic report showing thousands of patients in similar situations. "I wasn't lying about the struggle, Jessica. I was experiencing it authentically. For 6 months, I lived as Margaret Reeves, a woman whose only income was a modest pension and whose only insurance was Medicare with a high-deductible supplemental plan. I rented a studio apartment, opened a bank account with limited funds, and navigated the healthcare system exactly the way millions of Americans do every day." Jessica picked up one of the prescription bottles, examining the label that showed Margaret Reeves as the patient. "But you could have afforded the medications as yourself. You chose to struggle." "Yes, I chose to struggle so I could understand what our patients experience. And you know what I learned?" Margaret's voice grew stronger, more certain. "I learned that even with insurance, Even with assistance programs, even with caring physicians, the system is designed to exhaust people into giving up. I learned that the stress of financial worry can actually worsen health conditions. And I learned that people like you, people who work in industries that profit from patient suffering, genuinely believe that market forces are more important than human dignity. Jessica set down the prescription bottle and looked directly at her mother for the first time since the revelation. People like me? Mom, I'm your daughter. I work in corporate law, not healthcare. I don't have anything to do with patient suffering. Margaret pulled out her phone and scrolled to a recording app. Actually, let me play something for you. This is from our conversation last week about Brad's acquisition plans. Jessica's own voice filled the room, clear and confident. The patients will figure it out. Maybe they'll get better insurance or find different medications or qualify for assistance programs. The market always finds a way to work these things out. The recording continued with Margaret's question about what would happen if she were one of those patients, followed by Jessica's response. If you can't afford the market price for something, you find alternatives or you do without. That's not cruel, it's just reality. Jessica's face went pale as she heard her own words played back. I didn't know I was talking about you. If I had known. If you had known what, Jessica? That the patient was someone you cared about? That changes the moral calculus? The woman who couldn't afford her heart medication deserved compassion only if she happened to be related to you? Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city where thousands of patients were making impossible choices between health and financial survival. Do you understand what you told me last week? You told your mother that if she couldn't afford to stay alive, she should simply die. You reduced my life to a market transaction and decided I wasn't worth the investment. The words hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Jessica opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently unable to find words that could address the magnitude of what had been revealed. For 25 years, Margaret continued, I built this company on the principle that healthcare is a human right, not a luxury commodity. I've spent my entire career developing affordable medications and creating assistance programs specifically to help people like Margaret Reeves. And my own daughter, the person I raised to understand the value of compassion and social responsibility, told me that market efficiency was more important than my life. Jessica finally found her voice, though it was barely above a whisper. Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't understand. I didn't know what you were going through. Margaret turned back to face her daughter. But you did know what Margaret Reeves was going through. You knew an elderly woman was struggling to afford life-saving medication. You knew she was asking for help from the person who should have cared about her most. The only thing you didn't know was that she was someone you were supposed to love. And that tells me everything I need to know about who you've become. The silence that followed, Margaret's words stretched between them like a chasm that had taken years to form and only minutes to reveal. Jessica sat frozen in her chair, staring at the evidence spread across the conference table as if it might rearrange itself into something less devastating. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the shock and growing horror in her eyes as the full implications of her mother's revelation settled in. I need you to understand something, Margaret said, returning to her seat but maintaining the composed authority of a CEO delivering a crucial presentation. This isn't just about you and me. This is about the fundamental worldview you've adopted and how it affects real people's lives every single day. Margaret opened her laptop and projected a presentation onto the large monitor mounted on the office wall. The first slide showed a photograph of an elderly man sitting in a pharmacy. Parking lot, his head in his hands. This is Thomas Patterson, 73 years old, diabetic, retired mechanic from Oakland. He rationed his insulin for 3 months because he couldn't afford the full prescription. He's now in intensive care at UCSF Medical Center, fighting for his life because of diabetic ketoacidosis. Jessica looked at the image, then back at her mother. Mom, what does this have to do with... Everything, Margaret interrupted, advancing to the next slide. This is Maria Santos, 45. Mother of 3, works 2 part-time jobs, neither of which provides health insurance. She stopped taking her heart medication 6 weeks ago because the cost increased when the manufacturer was acquired by a larger pharmaceutical company that tripled the price overnight. The slides continued, each one showing a photograph and brief description of patients whose lives had been affected by the kind of market-driven healthcare policies Jessica had been advocating. A construction worker who lost his job due to a heart attack he couldn't afford to prevent. A grandmother who chose between her blood pressure medication and her granddaughter's school supplies. A college student who ended up hospitalized because he couldn't afford his asthma inhaler. These aren't statistics, Jessica. These aren't abstract economic data points. These are human beings whose suffering has been deemed acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of maximum profit margins. And last week you told me that I should join their ranks. Jessica's professional composure finally cracked completely. Tears began streaming down her cheeks as she whispered, "I didn't know. I thought you were just being overly emotional about hypothetical situations. I never imagined you were actually experiencing this yourself." Margaret felt a flicker of the maternal instinct that had once driven her to sacrifice everything for Jessica's well-being, but she forced herself to remain, focused on the lesson that needed to be learned. But I wasn't just experiencing it myself. I was experiencing what millions of people go through every day. The only difference between me and Thomas Patterson or Maria Santos is that I had the option to end my experiment whenever I chose. They don't have that luxury. The next slide showed financial data from Meridian Therapeutics, including profit margins, research and development costs, and pricing structures. Do you know what our profit margin is on the cardiac medication I couldn't afford as Margaret Reeves? Jessica shook her head, still wiping tears from her cheeks. 18%. We make 18% profit on a medication that costs us $43 to manufacture and sells for $52. Most pharmaceutical companies charge between $300 and $600 for equivalent medications, generating profit margins of 800 to 1,200%. Margaret advanced to a slide showing comparative pricing across the industry. We've proven that you can develop life-saving medications, maintain quality standards, fund continued research, pay employees competitive salaries, and still make a reasonable profit without pricing patients out of staying alive. But according to your market efficiency theory, we're leaving money on the table. I was wrong, Jessica said quietly. I can see that now. But Mom, I'm not involved in pharmaceutical pricing decisions. I do corporate law for technology companies and real estate firms. I'm not responsible for healthcare policy. Margaret's expression grew stern. You're not directly responsible, but you're complicit. You vote for politicians who prioritize corporate profits over patient welfare. You invest in funds that include pharmaceutical companies with predatory pricing practices. You socialize with people who view human suffering as an acceptable cost of doing business. And most importantly, you've adopted a worldview that treats market outcomes as moral imperatives. The next slide showed news articles about pharmaceutical acquisitions, including several deals that Brad's law firm had facilitated. Your boyfriend Brad has personally worked on 3 acquisitions in the past 2 years that resulted in medication price increases of over 400%. He's not just observing market forces, he's actively participating in creating them. Jessica looked genuinely shocked. Brad never told me his deals affected medication pricing. Of course he didn't. It's easier to participate in systems that cause harm when you don't have to think about the consequences. That's the privilege of your socioeconomic position, Jessica. You get to treat healthcare as an abstract business concept because you've never had to choose between medication and rent. Margaret stood and walked to a cabinet, retrieving a thick folder. I want to show you something else. These are letters from patients who participate in our assistance programs. Real letters from real people whose lives have been affected by our pricing policies. She handed Jessica a letter written in shaky handwriting on plain notebook paper. This is from Dorothy Chen, no relation despite the name. She's 81, lives in Fresno, diabetic and hypertensive. Read it out loud. Jessica took the letter with trembling hands and began to read. Dear Dr. Chen and everyone at Meridian Therapeutics, I don't know how to thank you for making my medications affordable. Before I found your assistance program, I was cutting my pills in half and skipping doses to make them last longer. My doctor warned me that this was dangerous, but I couldn't choose between my medicine and my rent. Your program saved my life, literally. I pray for you and your family every night because you gave me the chance to see my great-grandchildren grow up. God bless you for remembering that patients are people, not just customers. Jessica's voice broke on the final sentence, and she set the letter down with shaking hands. She prays for our family. She prays for us because we chose to treat her with dignity instead of viewing her as a profit opportunity. She's grateful that we didn't force her to choose between survival and financial stability. Margaret's voice softened slightly. That's what healthcare should be about, Jessica. Helping people maintain their dignity while they fight for their lives. Margaret returned to her presentation, showing a slide with Jessica's own words from their recent conversations. But you told me that if people can't afford market prices, they should do without. You told me that patients will figure it out. You told me that market forces are more important than individual suffering. The confrontation with her own words, displayed in stark black text against a white background, seemed to hit Jessica like a physical blow. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed, the carefully constructed professional persona she had maintained for years finally collapsing under the weight of moral reality. I never thought about it in personal terms, she gasped between sobs. I never connected the business theories to actual people. I never imagined that someone I loved could be affected by these policies. But that's exactly the problem, Margaret replied firmly. Moral principles shouldn't change based on personal relationships. Dorothy Chen deserves the same compassion you would want for me. Thomas Patterson deserves the same dignity you would want for yourself. The market forces you've been advocating don't discriminate between strangers and family members. Margaret sat back down, her expression showing both sorrow and determination. I'm going to tell you something that might be difficult to hear. Your father would be ashamed of who you've become. Jessica looked up sharply, her tear-stained face, showing both hurt and anger. That's not fair. Dad loved me unconditionally. He loved you unconditionally, yes. But he also believed that privilege came with responsibility. He believed that success should be used to lift others up, not to insulate yourself from their struggles. The daughter he raised would never have told a struggling patient to do without life-saving medication. Margaret opened another folder and removed a photograph of David taken during one of Meridian's early charity events. He was kneeling next to a young boy with diabetes, explaining how insulin worked while the child's mother watched gratefully from nearby. Your father spent his career ensuring that our business practices reflected our values. He could have maximized profits, but he chose to maximize impact. He could have focused solely on shareholder returns, but he prioritized patient outcomes. He built this company as a legacy for you, hoping you would carry forward his commitment to using business as a force for good. Jessica stared at the photograph, fresh tears streaming down her face. I've disappointed both of you. You've lost your way, Margaret corrected. But disappointment implies that the situation can't be changed. You're sitting in the headquarters of a pharmaceutical company that proves every day that you can be successful without exploiting vulnerable people. You're looking at evidence that compassionate business practices actually work better than predatory ones. The question is, what you're going to do with this knowledge. Margaret advanced to the final slide in her presentation, which showed a simple question in large text. What kind of person do you want to be? This isn't just about our relationship, Jessica. This is about the fundamental choice you need to make about your values and priorities. You can continue working for firms that facilitate predatory business practices, dating men who profit from human suffering, and investing in systems that prioritize wealth accumulation over human dignity. Or you can choose a different path. Jessica wiped her eyes and looked directly at her mother for the first time since the revelation began. What would that different path look like? Margaret smiled for the first time during their conversation, seeing a glimmer of the compassionate, young woman she had raised. It would look like using your legal skills to help people instead of exploiting them. It would look like choosing relationships with people who share your values instead of people who validate your bank account. It would look like investing your money and your time in causes that make the world better for people like Dorothy Chen and Thomas Patterson. But I've built my entire career around corporate law. I don't know anything about healthcare law or patient advocacy. You know more than you think. You understand contract negotiations, regulatory compliance, business structures, and financial analysis. Those skills could be incredibly valuable in healthcare advocacy, pharmaceutical oversight, or even working for companies like Meridian that are trying to do business ethically. Margaret stood and walked to her desk, retrieving a business card from the top drawer. This is Patricia Rodriguez, the Executive Director of the National Patient Advocacy Foundation. They're looking for lawyers who understand corporate structures well enough to identify and challenge predatory practices in the pharmaceutical industry. The pay is about 60% of what you're making now, but the work actually helps people. Jessica took the business card and studied it carefully. You've thought about this. I've had 6 months to think about this. 6 months of experiencing the healthcare system as a powerless patient while simultaneously running a company dedicated to changing that system. 6 months of watching my daughter become someone I didn't recognize while hoping she would find her way back to the values we raised her with. Margaret returned to her seat and leaned forward, her voice taking on the gentle tone she had used when Jessica was a child facing difficult decisions. I'm not asking you to make any commitments today. I'm asking you to think seriously about the kind of person you want to be and the kind of world you want to live in. Do you want to be someone who profits from human suffering or someone who works to reduce it? Jessica was quiet for several minutes, turning Patricia Rodriguez's business card over in her hands while processing everything she had learned. Finally, she looked up at Margaret with an expression that combined shame, gratitude, and determination. I want to call Brad and break up with him. Margaret raised an eyebrow. That's your first priority? He's everything that's wrong with my current life. He's selfish, greedy, completely disconnected from the impact of his work, and he's influenced me to become more like him. If I'm going to change direction, I need to stop surrounding myself with people who reinforce the worst parts of who I've become. That's a good start. What else? Jessica took a deep breath before answering. I want to apologize, not just to you, but to every patient I've indirectly harmed by supporting policies that prioritize profit over people. I know that won't undo the damage, but I need to acknowledge what I've done. And then? Then I want to learn. I want to understand healthcare policy, pharmaceutical regulation, patient advocacy, and how I can use my legal background to help instead of harm. I want to meet Dorothy Chen and apologize to her personally for the attitude I've had toward patients like her. Margaret felt tears welling up in her own eyes for the first time during their conversation. Dorothy would like that. She'd also like to know that her prayers for our family were answered. Jessica stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city where thousands of patients were struggling with the same challenges Margaret had experienced as Margaret Reeves. How do I make amends for years of being part of the problem? By spending the rest of your career being part of the solution. By using your privilege and education and connections to fight for people who don't have those advantages. By remembering that every policy decision, every business deal, every investment choice affects real people with real faces and real families. Margaret joined her daughter at the window, and for the first time in months, she felt genuine hope for their relationship. Your father used to say that the measure of a person's character isn't whether they make mistakes, but how they respond when they realize they've made them. Today, you have the chance to show what kind of character you really have. Jessica turned away from the window and hugged her mother tightly. The kind of full, desperate hug that communicates years of missed connection and newfound understanding. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for dismissing your struggles, for prioritizing money over people, for becoming someone Dad wouldn't recognize. I want to do better. Margaret held her daughter close, feeling the weight of months of deception and disappointment finally lifting from her shoulders. I forgive you, and more importantly, I believe you can change. But Jessica, you need to understand that this isn't just about us. There are millions of people whose lives depend on whether people in positions of privilege choose compassion or indifference. They separated from their embrace, and Jessica wiped away fresh tears with a shaky smile. Where do I start? Margaret walked to her desk and pulled out a thick folder. Start by reading these patient stories. All of them. Let yourself feel the weight of what market-driven healthcare policies actually mean for real families. Then, call Patricia Rodriguez and set up an informational interview. And then decide whether you're ready to use your talents to help people instead of exploiting them. As Jessica gathered the materials her mother had given her, Margaret felt a complex mixture of exhaustion and relief. The revelation had been as painful as she had anticipated, but it had also been more successful than she had dared to hope. Her daughter wasn't irredeemably lost to greed and indifference. She had simply lost her way in a system that rewarded selfishness and punished compassion. There's one more thing, Margaret said as Jessica prepared to leave. I'm going to continue operating Meridian Therapeutics according to the principles your father and I established. That means prioritizing patient access over profit margins, maintaining assistance programs even when they reduce our revenue, and refusing acquisition offers from companies that would change our pricing structure. Jessica nodded. I wouldn't expect anything different. But I'm also going to expand our mission. I want to create a foundation that helps other pharmaceutical companies adopt ethical pricing practices. I want to lobby for policy changes that protect patients from predatory pricing. And I want to establish a scholarship program for students who want to pursue careers in patient advocacy and healthcare justice. That sounds like something Dad would have supported. It's something I hope you'll support too. Not necessarily by working for Meridian, but by using whatever career path you choose to advance the same values. Jessica paused at the office door, clutching the folder of patient stories to her chest. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. When you were living as Margaret Reeves, struggling to afford your medications, what kept you going? What prevented you from giving up? Margaret considered the question carefully. 2 things. First, I knew that my struggle was temporary and voluntary, while millions of people face the same challenges with no escape route. That gave me perspective on how privileged my situation really was, even at its worst. And second, I thought about your father's belief that everyone deserves dignity and respect, regardless of their financial circumstances. Even when I felt most alone and powerless, I held on to the hope that compassionate people would eventually recognize the moral urgency of healthcare justice. And now? Now I know that compassionate people do exist, and they're closer than I thought. It just took a dramatic revelation to remind one of them who she really is. Jessica smiled through her tears and left the office, carrying with her not just patient stories and business cards, but a completely transformed understanding of her responsibility to use her advantages in service of others rather than herself. Margaret remained in her office for a long time after Jessica left, watching the sun set over the Bay Area and reflecting on the day's events. The experiment that had begun as an attempt to understand patient struggles had evolved into something much more significant, a lesson in moral courage, family values, and the possibility of redemption. Her phone rang, interrupting her contemplation. The caller ID showed Dr. Williams's number, Dr. Chen, I hope I'm not calling too late. I wanted to check on Mrs. Reeves. She missed her follow-up appointment today, and I'm concerned about her medication compliance. Margaret smiled, realizing that one chapter of her double life was ending while another was beginning. Dr. Williams, Mrs. Reeves won't be needing any more appointments. Her situation has been resolved. Oh, wonderful. Did she qualify for assistance programs? Something like that. Her family stepped up to help, and she now has access to all the medications she needs. That's such good news. I was really worried about her. She seemed so alone and overwhelmed. Margaret looked out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness. She's not alone anymore. And Dr. Williams, thank you for everything you did to help her. Your compassion made a difference during a very difficult time. After ending the call, Margaret made one final entry in the journal she had kept throughout her patient experiment. She wrote about the revelation, about Jessica's transformation, and about her hopes for the future. But mostly, she wrote about the lesson she had learned. That sometimes the most powerful way to teach someone about compassion is to show them the consequences of its absence. The next morning, Margaret returned to her studio apartment as Margaret Reeves for the last time. She packed up the few belongings she had accumulated during her months of living as a struggling patient, but she kept the prescription bottles, medical bills, and patient assistance program applications. They would serve as permanent reminders of what millions of Americans experienced every day, and of her responsibility to ensure that her company remained committed to accessible health care. As she drove away from the modest neighborhood where Margaret Reeves had lived, Margaret reflected on how much she had learned during her months of deception. She had discovered the gaps in the healthcare system, the inadequacies of assistance, programs, and the psychological toll of financial stress on patient health. But most importantly, she had learned that her daughter was capable of growth, change, and moral courage when confronted with the truth about her choices. 6 months later, Jessica called to tell her mother about her new job at the National Patient Advocacy Foundation, where she was using her corporate law background to challenge predatory pharmaceutical pricing practices. Brad had been furious about their breakup and had accused Jessica of throwing away her career for idealistic nonsense. But Jessica had recognized his reaction as confirmation that she was making the right choice. "I met Dorothy Chen last week," Jessica said during one of their regular phone calls. "She invited me to her great-granddaughter's birthday party. How did that go?" "She thanked me for my work with the foundation, and I told her that I was the one who should be thanking her. She didn't understand what I meant, but someday I'll explain it to her." Margaret smiled, remembering the elderly woman whose grateful letter had played such a crucial role in Jessica's transformation. "I think she would appreciate knowing that her prayers were answered in ways she never could have imagined." The Meridian Therapeutics Foundation had launched successfully, providing grants to other pharmaceutical companies willing to adopt ethical pricing practices and supporting research into new models for sustainable, accessible medication development. Margaret had also established the David Chen Memorial Scholarship for students pursuing careers in healthcare justice, ensuring that future generations would have the resources and support needed to continue their mission. But perhaps the most significant outcome of Margaret's experiment was the restoration of her relationship with Jessica. They had begun working together on healthcare policy initiatives, combining Margaret's industry expertise with Jessica's legal skills to advocate for systemic changes that would protect patients from predatory pricing practices. "You know, Jessica," said during one of their strategy sessions, "I used to think that business success meant maximizing profits regardless of the consequences. Now I understand that real success means creating value for everyone affected by your decisions." Margaret looked at her daughter with pride and gratitude. "Your father would be proud of who you've become." "I hope so. I have a lot of work to do to make up for the years I spent as part of the problem." "The work itself is the making up," Margaret replied. "Every patient you help, every predatory practice you challenge, Every policy you improve contributes to a healthcare system that treats people with dignity instead of exploiting their vulnerabilities. As Margaret reflected on the journey that had led them to this point, she realized that her experiment in patient advocacy had succeeded beyond her original goals. She had not only gained insight into the patient experience, but had also discovered that the most important laboratory for testing moral principles wasn't her research facility at Meridian Therapeutics. It was the real world, where every decision about pricing, policy, and priorities affected real people's ability to maintain their health, dignity, and hope. The woman who had once counted coins at a pharmacy counter while her daughter dismissed her struggles as character flaws had become the catalyst for a transformation that would benefit thousands of patients for years to come. And the daughter who had once viewed human suffering as acceptable market outcomes had become a fierce advocate for healthcare justice, proving that even the most fundamental worldviews could change when confronted with truth, love, and the courage to acknowledge past mistakes. In the end, Margaret's deception had revealed something much more important than the failures of the healthcare system. It had revealed the power of redemption, the possibility of moral growth, and the enduring strength of family bonds that are built on shared values rather than convenient assumptions. The pharmaceutical company she had built to honor her late husband's memory continued to thrive while maintaining its commitment to accessible healthcare. The daughter she had feared was lost to greed, and indifference had found her way back to compassion and service. And the patients who depended on affordable medications continued to receive them from a company that viewed their dignity as more valuable than maximum profit margins. Margaret's experiment as Margaret Reeves had ended, but her mission as Dr. Margaret Chen continued, supported now by a daughter who understood that the greatest privilege of success is the opportunity to use it in service of others who face challenges they didn't choose and obstacles they can't overcome alone. 3 years had passed since that transformative afternoon in Margaret's office at Meridian Therapeutics, and the ripple effects of her revelation continued to spread far beyond what either she or Jessica could have imagined. What had begun as a personal experiment in understanding patient struggles had evolved into a movement that was quietly reshaping how pharmaceutical companies approached pricing, patient access, and corporate responsibility. Margaret stood at the podium of the International Healthcare Ethics Conference in Geneva, addressing an audience of pharmaceutical executives, healthcare policymakers, and patient advocates from around the world. Her hair was now completely silver, worn with pride rather than hidden with dye, and her eyes held the wisdom that comes from experiencing both sides of the healthcare equation. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak about healthcare justice through lived experience. "I want to tell you about a woman named Margaret Reeves. She was 72 years old, diabetic, struggling with heart disease, and faced with an impossible choice between her medication and her rent. Margaret Reeves taught me more about pharmaceutical ethics in 6 months than I had learned in 25 years as a CEO." The audience leaned forward, captivated by Margaret's storytelling. Many of them knew her reputation as the founder of Meridian Therapeutics, but few knew the full story of her patient experiment and its aftermath. "Margaret Reeves was me," Margaret continued, watching as understanding dawned on faces throughout the auditorium. "For 6 months, I lived as an ordinary patient, experiencing firsthand the barriers, indignities, and impossible choices that millions of people face when they can't afford their medications. What I learned changed not only my perspective on healthcare, but also my relationship with my daughter and my understanding of what it truly means to build an ethical pharmaceutical company." As Margaret shared her story with the international audience, Jessica was across the Atlantic in a congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C., presenting testimony on behalf of the coalition of patient advocacy organizations she now helped coordinate. Her transformation from corporate lawyer to healthcare justice advocate had been complete and irreversible, driven by the memory of her mother counting coins at a pharmacy counter, while Jessica dismissed her struggles as character flaws. Senators, Jessica said, addressing the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. I want you to imagine calling your mother for help with a medical emergency, only to be told that you need to learn better financial management. I want you to imagine being so desperate for life-saving medication that you ration pills, skip doses, and pray that your body can survive on half the treatment your doctor prescribed. The senators listened intently as Jessica presented data showing the human cost of pharmaceutical pricing policies. But her most powerful moments came when she shared personal stories from patients whose lives had been transformed by accessible medication programs. Dorothy Chen, 84 years old, grandmother of 7, great-grandmother of 3, writes thank you letters every month to pharmaceutical companies that price their medications affordably. She doesn't write these letters because she's required to, but because she's grateful to be alive to watch her family grow. That gratitude exists because some companies have chosen to prioritize patient dignity over maximum profit margins. Jessica's voice carried the passion of someone who had experienced a profound moral awakening. Her colleagues at the National Patient Advocacy Foundation often marveled at her transformation from someone who had once viewed healthcare as a commodity to someone who fought tirelessly for the principle that access to medication should never depend on wealth. Meanwhile, the Meridian Therapeutics Foundation had become a model for how pharmaceutical companies could balance profitability with social responsibility. Under Margaret's leadership, the foundation had provided grants to 43 smaller pharmaceutical companies, helping them adopt ethical pricing practices while maintaining financial sustainability. The foundation's impact extended beyond individual companies to influence industry standards and regulatory approaches. Dr. Patricia Williams, the physician who had shown such kindness to Margaret during her months as Margaret Reeves, had become an advisory board member for the foundation. She often spoke at medical conferences about the importance of pharmaceutical companies understanding the patient experience from a perspective of vulnerability rather than power. What Dr. Chen did was remarkable not because she temporarily lived as a struggling patient, Dr. Williams explained to a group of medical students during a lecture on healthcare ethics, but because she allowed that experience to fundamentally change how she approached her role as a pharmaceutical executive. She proved that empathy isn't just a nice sentiment, but a practical tool for creating better healthcare policies. The medical students, many of whom would go on to prescribe medications developed by companies like Meridian Therapeutics, listened carefully as Dr. Williams described the difference between pharmaceutical companies that viewed patients as customers versus those that viewed them as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. Brad Martinez, Jessica's former boyfriend, had taken a very different path following their breakup. His law firm had continued facilitating pharmaceutical acquisitions that resulted in dramatic price increases, and he had been promoted to partner. Based on his success in structuring deals that maximized returns for investors while minimizing legal liability for price gouging claims. During a chance encounter at a San Francisco restaurant, Brad had attempted to convince Jessica that her career change was a mistake that would ultimately limit her earning potential and professional advancement. "You're throwing away everything we worked for," he had argued during their uncomfortable conversation. "You could have been making partner at a major firm by now, building real wealth, establishing yourself as a serious legal professional. Instead, you're working for advocacy groups that will never be able to pay you what you're worth." Jessica's response had been calm but firm. "You're right that I'm making less money than I could in corporate law, but you're wrong about what I'm worth. My worth isn't measured by my billable hours or my investment portfolio. It's measured by whether I'm using my skills to help people or to exploit them." The conversation had ended with Brad shaking his head in bewilderment, unable to understand how someone could voluntarily choose a career path that prioritized social impact over financial advancement. His incomprehension had served as a reminder to Jessica of how completely her values had shifted since her mother's revelation. Thomas Patterson, the diabetic mechanic whose story Margaret had shared during Jessica's confrontation, had become an unexpected symbol of the foundation's impact. After nearly dying from rationing his insulin, Thomas had been connected with Meridian's patient assistance program and had regained stable health. He had also become a volunteer spokesperson for diabetes awareness and pharmaceutical accessibility, sharing his story at patient advocacy events and congressional hearings. "I never thought anyone in a fancy office cared about people like me," Thomas said during a foundation fundraising dinner, where Margaret was being honored for her contributions to healthcare justice. But Dr. Chen and her daughter proved that some people with power actually use it to help folks who don't have any power at all. Thomas's words carried special weight because he represented millions of patients who had felt invisible and disposable within the healthcare system. His presence at foundation events served as a constant reminder that pharmaceutical policies affected real people with real families and real struggles. Maria Santos, the mother of 3 who had stopped taking her heart medication due to cost increases, had also benefited from the foundation's initiatives. After being connected with assistance programs, Maria had not only regained access to her medications, but had also become a community health advocate in her Oakland neighborhood, helping other families navigate the complex landscape of healthcare assistance programs. "Dr. Chen didn't just save my life," Maria explained to a group of pharmaceutical executives during a foundation presentation. "She gave me the tools to help save other people's lives. When companies choose to make medications affordable, they're not just helping individual patients, they're strengthening entire communities." The foundation's success had attracted attention from healthcare economists and policy researchers who were studying the Meridian model as a potential template for industry-wide reform. Dr. Rachel Morrison, a healthcare economist at Stanford University, had published several papers analyzing the financial sustainability of ethical pricing practices in the pharmaceutical industry. "What's remarkable about Meridian Therapeutics and similar companies," Dr. Morrison wrote in her most cited paper, "is that they've demonstrated the false choice that's often presented between profitability and accessibility. By focusing on volume, efficiency, and long-term sustainability, rather than maximum short-term profits, these companies have actually achieved better financial performance than many of their competitors while serving significantly more patients." The research had provided academic validation for what Margaret had long believed, that treating patients with dignity and respect wasn't just morally right, but also economically sound. Companies that built trust with patients, physicians, and communities created sustainable competitive advantages that couldn't be replicated through pricing manipulation or aggressive marketing tactics. Jessica's work with congressional committees had led to the introduction of the Patient Dignity in Pharmaceutical Pricing Act, legislation that would require pharmaceutical companies to justify price increases above certain thresholds and demonstrate that their pricing practices consider patient access alongside shareholder returns. While the legislation faced significant opposition from industry lobbying groups, it had gained support from patient advocacy organizations, medical associations, and a growing number of legislators who had heard testimonials from constituents struggling with medication costs. "This isn't about punishing pharmaceutical companies for being successful," Jessica explained during a press conference announcing the legislation. "This is about ensuring that success in the pharmaceutical industry includes success in serving patients, not just success in maximizing profits." The legislation had also attracted support from progressive pharmaceutical executives who recognized that voluntary industry reform was preferable to regulatory mandates, but who needed political cover to implement more patient-friendly policies within their own companies. Margaret's relationship with Jessica had evolved from the traditional mother-daughter dynamic to a true partnership in healthcare advocacy. They frequently appeared together at conferences and policy events, with Margaret providing industry expertise and Jessica contributing legal and policy analysis. Their joint presentations were particularly powerful because they demonstrated how family relationships could survive and even strengthen when built on shared values, rather than shared assumptions. "My mother taught me that the most dangerous form of privilege is the privilege of not having to think about the consequences of your choices," Jessica said during a joint presentation at Harvard Medical School. When I was working in corporate law, I had the privilege of treating patient suffering as an abstract economic concept. My mother's experiment forced me to confront the reality that my professional choices affected real people's ability to stay alive and maintain their dignity. Margaret's response during the same presentation had focused on the importance of institutional change rather than individual transformation. Jessica's career change is meaningful, but individual conversions aren't sufficient to address systemic problems. We need pharmaceutical companies, medical schools, law firms, and government agencies to embed patient-centered thinking into their institutional cultures and decision-making processes. The David Chen Memorial Scholarship Program had grown beyond Margaret's original vision, providing support not only for students pursuing healthcare justice careers, but also for community health workers, patient advocates, and family members, caring for people with chronic conditions. The scholarship recipients came from diverse backgrounds, but shared a commitment to ensuring that healthcare access didn't depend on socioeconomic status. One scholarship recipient, Carlos Mendoza, had lost his grandfather to complications from diabetes because the family couldn't afford consistent medication. Carlos was now studying health policy at UC Berkeley and planned to work on expanding community health programs in underserved neighborhoods. Mr. Chen never met my grandfather, Carlos said during a scholarship ceremony, but his values live on through programs that help families like mine. Dr. Chen and Jessica are continuing his work by making sure that other families don't have to watch their loved ones suffer because they can't afford medicine. The scholarship program had also created a network of young professionals working in various aspects of healthcare justice, from policy advocacy to community organizing to ethical pharmaceutical development. This network provided both professional support and personal connection for people who had chosen career paths that prioritized social impact over financial advancement. Dorothy Chen, the elderly woman whose grateful letter had played such a crucial role in Jessica's transformation, had become an informal grandmother figure to the entire foundation community. At 87, she still attended foundation events when her health permitted, and her presence served as a living reminder of why accessible healthcare mattered. "I've seen a lot of changes in my life," Dorothy said during her remarks at the foundation's 5th anniversary celebration. "But I never thought I'd see the day when pharmaceutical companies would compete to see who could help the most patients, instead of who could make the most money." Dr. Chen and Jessica have shown that business can be a force for good when it's guided by the right values. Margaret's own health had stabilized completely once she returned to taking her medications consistently as Dr. Margaret Chen, rather than rationing them as Margaret Reeves. The stress and anxiety that had accompanied her months of financial worry about medication costs had dissipated, providing additional evidence for the connection between economic stress and health outcomes that she frequently cited in her advocacy work. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret that her deliberate experience of healthcare vulnerability had ultimately made her a more effective advocate for pharmaceutical accessibility. By understanding both the industry perspective and the patient perspective, she could communicate with pharmaceutical executives, policymakers, and patient advocates in ways that built bridges rather than deepened divisions. The goal isn't to eliminate the pharmaceutical industry or to expect companies to operate as charities, Margaret explained during a television interview about healthcare reform. The goal is to help the industry understand that serving patients well is actually the path to sustainable long-term success. Companies that build trust with patients and communities create competitive advantages that can't be replicated through pricing manipulation or regulatory capture. As Margaret reflected on the 3 years since her revelation to Jessica, she realized that her patient experiment had succeeded beyond her wildest expectations. Not only had she gained insight into the patient experience and restored her relationship with her daughter, but she had also catalyzed a movement that was slowly changing how the pharmaceutical industry approached its responsibilities to patients and communities. The woman who had once counted coins at a pharmacy counter while her daughter dismissed her struggles had become the catalyst for institutional changes that would benefit millions of patients for decades to come. The daughter, who had once viewed human suffering as acceptable market outcomes had become a nationally recognized advocate for healthcare justice. But perhaps most importantly, Margaret had learned that the most powerful laboratory for testing moral principles wasn't her research facility at Meridian Therapeutics or even the healthcare system itself. It was the human heart, where empathy and indifference competed for dominance, and where the choice between compassion and selfishness determined not only individual character, but also the moral trajectory of entire industries and societies. The story that had begun with pharmaceutical pills and family betrayal had evolved into a testament to the possibility of redemption, the power of truth, and the enduring strength of relationships built on shared values rather than convenient assumptions. Margaret's deception had revealed something much more important than the failures of the healthcare system. It had revealed the capacity for transformation that exists within every person willing to confront the consequences of their choices and choose a different path forward. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.